The first thing Caleb Marsh noticed when he stepped outside that Thursday morning wasn't the silence. It was the skyline. The tree line that had bordered his east field for as long as he could remember was gone, replaced by a tangled wall of roots, mud, and timber stretching nearly 300 feet across the land he'd spent 12 years farming. 45 tons. That's what the forestry consultant would estimate 6 weeks later, after counting trunks, measuring diameters, and doing math that made Caleb's stomach turn. But standing there that morning in his mud-caked boots, he didn't need a number. He could feel the weight of it in his chest: oak, ash, black walnut, and a handful of old-growth sycamores, all of it flattened, twisted, and piled in a mess that made his east pasture look like the aftermath of a demolition. Fence posts snapped, the track to the lower barn blocked entirely. His tractor, trapped behind a wall of uprooted root plates taller than his pickup, 3 days of rain had done what 3 decades of storms hadn't. The soil along the creek edge had turned to slurry. The roots of a dozen mature trees, already compromised by last summer's drought, had simply let go. They didn't fall one by one. They went in sequence, each trunk pulling the next as it dropped, until half the woodlot was lying across a field that was supposed to carry winter barley. His neighbor, Dale Pruitt, came by that afternoon, stood at the field gate, shook his head slowly, and said what most people in the county were already thinking. "Hell of a cleanup job, Caleb. Best call someone with a chipper." If you believe that the worst moments sometimes carry something worth holding on to, subscribe. Tell me where you're watching from. Because what Caleb did with those fallen trees is something most people would have never considered. Caleb was 43, quiet by nature, and not the kind of man who made decisions fast. He'd inherited the 160-acre property from his uncle, not a gift so much as a responsibility, and had spent the better part of a decade nursing it back from years of neglect. He wasn't wealthy. He had a working tractor, a modest equipment shed, and a set of old timber framing manuals his grandfather had kept in a cardboard box in the attic. His grandfather had built 2 barns using trees taken from the same woodlot. Caleb had read those manuals cover to cover twice, and never used them for anything more than reference. Until now, maybe. He didn't call the chipper service. Not yet. Instead, he spent the first 4 days simply walking the wreckage. He wasn't counting trees. He was reading them. He'd learned enough from those old manuals, and from watching his uncle grade firewood years ago, to know that fallen timber isn't automatically ruined timber. What matters is species, diameter, age, and condition. A tree that goes down in a storm doesn't necessarily go down rotten. Sometimes the root system fails before the wood does. He pulled out his folding knife and started testing. The ash trees were a mixed picture. Some had softened bark, and when he cut into the outer layer, he found discoloration, signs of moisture damage that had already worked inward. He marked those with orange spray paint. Done. Firewood at best. But then he reached the black walnut. 4 of them, big, straight, old. The kind of trees that take 80 years to reach that diameter. He cut through the bark on the nearest trunk. The wood beneath was dense, clean, and almost purple-brown in the winter light. He stopped, cut again, a few feet further along. The same. Black walnut at that size isn't firewood. It's furniture stock. It's flooring. It's structural timber worth multiples of what it costs to process, if you have the patience to do it right. He stood up, looked down the length of that trunk, and did rough math in his head. Dale Pruitt called it storm debris. Caleb Marsh was standing on a lumber yard. A buyer came by the following week, a timber merchant from 2 counties over who'd heard about the fallen trees through the local agricultural office. He walked the field with his hands in his pockets, made low sounds of modest interest, and offered Caleb $14,500 for the right to remove everything usable. It wasn't nothing. The farm had eaten most of Caleb's savings that year. A failed grain harvest, a seized gearbox on the baler, 3 months of vet bills. $14,500 would have cleared the immediate pressure. He told the merchant he'd think about it. He thought about it for one night. Then he called his cousin, who ran a small portable sawmill operation 2 hours north, and asked what it would cost to bring the rig down for a week. The answer was considerably less than $14,500. The first obstacle wasn't the sawmill, it was the weight. Getting 45 tons of timber off a saturated field without sinking every piece of equipment he owned required improvisation that Caleb's neighbors found either admirable or faintly absurd, depending on their temperament. He used a system of skid poles, essentially temporary rails made from the straightest smaller trunks, to drag the larger logs to the field edge on his front loader without churning the soil into a complete loss. It took 10 days. It was slow, ungainly work, and it cost him a loader tire on a buried root plate, but it worked. The portable mill arrived in late February. Caleb had his logs staged, measured, and sorted by species. His cousin, a methodical man named Roy, walked the row of logs and said almost nothing for 5 minutes. Then he said, "You've got real timber here." Milling began the next morning. This is where Caleb made his first serious mistake. Freshly cut green lumber, wood that has just been sawn from a recently felled tree, contains a significant amount of moisture. Water moves through wood unevenly. It leaves faster from the end grain, the exposed cross-section at each cut end, than it does from the surface along the plank's length. If you dry lumber too fast, or without adequate airflow between boards, the outside of the plank dries and shrinks before the center does. The result is checking, surface cracking, and in severe cases, cupping, twisting, or splits that render the board unusable. Caleb knew this intellectually. He'd read it in those manuals. What he miscalculated was the scale. He stacked the first run of milled boards in the equipment shed, out of the rain, which was correct, but he stacked them solid, without stickers. Thin wood spacers, placed horizontally between each layer to allow air to circulate. He didn't sticker the pile, he just laid boards flat on each other and assumed the shed's natural ventilation would do the job. 6 weeks later, he pulled the stack apart and found that the interior boards had developed significant checks. Not all of them, but enough to cost him nearly 40% of that first run in usable surface area. He sat on an overturned bucket in the shed for a long while. Then he restickered every remaining board correctly. 1-inch spacers every 2 feet along the length, and added a simple box fan to improve airflow. He also learned to paint the end grain of the larger beams with an old can of PVA glue, slowing the rate at which moisture escaped from the most vulnerable sections. The rest of the lumber dried over the following 5 months without a single additional loss. He had started with rough sketches, nothing formal, just dimensions on graph paper at the kitchen table in the evenings. But the more he worked with the timber, the more the idea clarified. The walnut deserved better than a shed. The ash deserved better than a barn wall. What emerged, slowly and without a grand announcement, was the outline of a single-room cabin, 24 by 18 feet, timber-framed, with a covered porch and a wood stove. He used his grandfather's manuals and supplemented them with a course at the County Agricultural Extension on traditional joinery. Roy drove down from the north the Friday before the raise. He'd said months earlier that he wanted to see what the timber became, and the frame went up in a single long weekend with his help and 2 other men, and a rented boom lift, mortise and tenon joints in the corner posts, wooden pegs, no metal plate connectors, the kind of construction that was standard in rural America for more than 2 centuries before engineered lumber made it feel unnecessary. George Washington Carver once observed that when you can do the common things of life in an uncommon way, you will command the attention of the world. Caleb wasn't thinking about the world. He was thinking about the walnut beam above the cabin door, and whether his grandfather would have been pleased with the fit. The floor was white oak. The walls were ash. The straight, clean sections he'd salvaged from the better-conditioned trunks. The interior ceiling boards were book-matched walnut panels that had been Roy's suggestion and Caleb's best decision. Dale Pruitt came by in October when the cabin was nearly finished. He stood on the porch for a while without saying anything, running his hand along the walnut doorframe. "This was those trees," he said finally. "Not a question. Most of it," Caleb said. Dale nodded slowly and didn't offer further commentary. A property professional who handled rural listings in the county came out at Caleb's request in November. She walked the interior, examined the timber joinery, stepped out onto the porch, and looked back at the structure for a long moment. Comparable properties in this area, finished cabin on acreage, quality construction, are listing between $85,000 and $95,000, she said. She walked back through the doorframe, ran her hand along the walnut grain one more time, and said, "This one, with the timber and the craftsmanship, I'd put at $90,000. $90,000. Built from timber that a merchant had offered to haul away for $14,500. Caleb didn't sell the cabin, a $90,000 asset on a farm that had been bleeding money 2 years earlier was worth more as long-term collateral than as a quick transaction. He rented it instead, quietly, through a rural vacation rental service. The income covered the farm's operating costs through the following spring and funded a second grazing season that he hadn't been able to afford the year before. 45 tons of storm-felled trees. To everyone who looked at that field in the days after the storm, those trees were a liability, a cleanup cost, a problem to be solved and removed. They were thinking about what the timber was. Caleb was thinking about what it could become. That's the difference. Not luck, not genius, just the willingness to stop, look more carefully than everyone else, and understand that raw material rarely announces its own value. That part is up to the person holding the saw. The storm didn't give Caleb a cabin, it gave him the raw components of one. Everything in between was patience, knowledge, and the refusal to let the first reasonable offer decide what something was worth.